Imagine waking up tomorrow and the sun never rises, not because it's cloudy, but because something in the sky is blocking the light. Days pass, then weeks. The air begins to change. There is a strange smell in the air. Sulfur. Plants begin to die, animals disappear, and slowly, the human population begins to collapse. At the worst moment of this catastrophe, the entire human species may have been reduced to just a few thousand survivors. A population so small it could almost fit inside a modern stadium. Every person alive today may descend from those few. This nightmare may have started with the largest volcanic eruption in human history. 74,000 years ago, humans were already spreading across the world. Small groups of hunter-gatherers lived across Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. They traveled constantly, following migrating animals, searching for water, avoiding predators. Human life was fragile. A typical tribe might include only 30 or 40 people. One harsh winter, one drought, one disease could wipe out an entire group. But despite these dangers, humanity was slowly expanding. Stone tools were becoming more sophisticated. People were learning to cooperate, to plan hunts, to pass knowledge between generations, and most importantly, humans had begun to master fire. This small advantage changed everything. Fire meant warmth, protection, cooked food, light in the darkness, and with fire came something even more powerful: community. But while early humans struggled for survival on the surface of the planet, something enormous was building deep beneath it. For thousands of years, pressure had been building beneath the Earth's crust. Deep underground, vast chambers of molten rock were slowly expanding. The ground above them began to crack. Earthquakes shook the surrounding landscape. Steam vents opened in the jungle. Animals fled from strange sulfurous smells rising from the earth. But the people living nearby had no way of understanding what was coming. Because the eruption that was about to begin would become the largest volcanic explosion in human history. On the island of Sumatra lies a massive volcanic system known today as Toba. Today, it appears peaceful. The enormous crater is filled with water, a lake nearly 100 kilometers long. But 74,000 years ago, this place was the center of a geological nightmare. Toba was not a normal volcano, it was a supervolcano. Supervolcanoes are capable of eruptions thousands of times larger than typical volcanic explosions. And when Toba finally erupted, the earth itself seemed to tear apart. The first explosion would have been unimaginable, a thunderclap louder than anything humans had ever heard. The ground shook violently across the island. A column of ash and gas blasted into the sky, rising more than 40 kilometers into the atmosphere. Then came the pyroclastic flows, walls of superheated gas, ash, and rock, racing across the land faster than a hurricane. Temperatures soared above 1,000 degrees Celsius. Entire forests were incinerated instantly. Rivers boiled. Animals had no chance to escape. The eruption continued for days, possibly weeks. By the time it ended, nearly 2,800 cubic kilometers of volcanic material had been blasted into the sky. To understand how enormous that is, the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980 released about 1 cubic kilometer of material. Toba released thousands of times more. It was the largest eruption Earth had experienced in the last 2.5 million years. But the destruction of the surrounding landscape was only the beginning, because the real catastrophe was already rising into the sky. The eruption hurled billions of tons of ash into the upper atmosphere. High above the planet, powerful winds began carrying the ash cloud across the globe. within days. Fine volcanic dust began falling across Southeast Asia, gray particles drifting slowly from the sky. Within weeks, the ash reached the Indian subcontinent, thousands of kilometers from the eruption itself. Scientists studying ancient sediments in India have discovered thick layers of Toba ash. Some deposits reach nearly 15 centimeters deep, more than 3,000 kilometers away. A reminder of just how enormous this eruption truly was. The particles themselves were incredibly small, tiny fragments of volcanic glass, sharp enough to damage lungs when inhaled. Heavy ashfall collapsed vegetation. Leaves bent under the weight, branches snapped. Entire forests were buried beneath gray dust. Rivers turned thick with sediment. Water sources became polluted and bitter to drink. But the most dangerous particles were not the ones that fell to the ground, because high in the upper atmosphere, a thin veil of volcanic aerosols was spreading around the entire planet. The eruption released massive amounts of sulfur gases. When those gases reached the upper atmosphere, they transformed into tiny particles known as sulfate aerosols. These particles reflected sunlight back into space, and slowly, the planet began to cool. This phenomenon is known as a volcanic winter. Climate models suggest that global temperatures may have dropped several degrees. That may not sound like much, but for a modern civilization, a drop of just a few degrees would be devastating. For prehistoric humans already living on the edge of survival, it could be catastrophic. Rainfall patterns began to change. In some regions, the rains simply stopped. Forests began to die. Grasslands withered. Plants struggled to grow, and slowly, the food chain began to collapse. Herbivores were the first to suffer. Starving animals wandered across empty landscapes. Predators followed, because a world without prey cannot sustain hunters. For humans, the crisis was even worse. Humans were not the strongest animals in the ecosystem. They were not the fastest. They relied on intelligence, on tools, on cooperation. But none of those advantages could guarantee survival in a world where food itself was disappearing. At some point in our ancient past, the human population became incredibly small. So small that scientists today can still see the evidence inside our DNA. Genetic studies reveal something remarkable. All humans alive today share a surprisingly similar genetic makeup, far more similar than most other species. This suggests that our ancestors passed through what scientists call a population bottleneck, a moment in history when the number of humans alive on Earth dropped dramatically. Some researchers believe that after the eruption of Toba, the global human population may have fallen to only 3,000 to 10,000 individuals. Imagine that, the entire future of our species. Every civilization, every city, every language, all reduced to a few thousand people scattered across the planet. Small tribes struggling to survive in a harsh and unpredictable world. If even a few of those groups had disappeared, humanity might never have recovered. Yet somehow, humans survived. Against the cold, against the hunger, against a world that had turned hostile. Archaeological evidence suggests that some groups found refuge in regions where food remained available. Certain places offered a fragile advantage. Coastal environments may have been especially important, because while the land struggled to recover, the oceans continued producing food. Shellfish, fish, seaweed, simple resources that did not depend as heavily on sunlight. Along rocky coastlines in southern Africa, small human groups may have gathered shellfish from shallow tidal pools, day after day, year after year, returning to the same shores as the tide rose and fell. It was not an easy life. They endured the cold, the hunger, the uncertainty of a world that had nearly destroyed them. But slowly, the planet began to heal. The ash settled, the skies cleared, plants returned to the landscape, animal populations began to recover, and the surviving human group slowly expanded once more. The descendants of those survivors would eventually spread across the entire planet. The eruption of Toba was one of the most powerful natural disasters our planet has ever experienced. It reshaped landscapes, altered climates, and may have pushed humanity closer to extinction than any other event in our history. Yet the story of Toba is not only a story about destruction, it is a story about resilience. Because the humans who survived this catastrophe were not the strongest, they were not the fastest, they were the most adaptable. They could change, innovate, cooperate. And those abilities would eventually allow humans to cross deserts, navigate oceans, and build civilizations. Every person alive today carries the legacy of those survivors. Because when the world nearly destroyed our species, humanity refused to disappear.